Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in a moment here. Just kind of getting set up. Hope you're having a good day so far and a good week. Can't believe it's almost Friday. I realize this is the 7th session that we have had Talmud Tales, so hard to believe it's been 7 weeks of being at home, and definitely some more still to come. So I hope you are filling your days with moments of learning new things about yourself and learning new things about the world. This is a great opportunity for us to be doing that. Okay. Again, thank you for being here. We're going to study another interesting story. I just have to say, I got a few emails from some people last week after last week's story about the ugly man. So first of all, I loved that. That was the highlight of my week, to receive some emails of people's further reflections on the story. To me, that's a sign of success, not of me, but of our tradition to hook you in. And that's my whole goal with this, is to hook you in to the fact that there are so many stories that we can learn from. And we're just looking at pieces of the Talmud. I mean, if we could expand this and go back to the Torah, there's so much out there. So you can see why I love this so much. Okay, another story today, but before we get into that, let's join together in the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kirishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for giving us the opportunity to engage in the study of Torah. All right, here we go. Let's look at this week's tale. Just another reminder of the Zoom protocol. I'm going to read through the story. I'm going to offer some thoughts, and then and then at the end, I would love your thoughts, your comments, your feedback, for us to have a little bit of a discussion about the text. So as with all the texts that we are looking at in this series, your goal with this is to understand what's happening here, what's the relevance to our life. Particularly this story, I want you to be thinking about who's at fault here. Now, that's the same question I asked last week as well for that story. You can sense there's a theme here that comes from the text itself. So it's not just my theme. The text itself is asking us who is responsible. Of course, one of the most important themes of our tradition is taking responsibility. One of the things that I tell all of my B'nai Mitzvah students is that they're not becoming adults when they turn 13. Far from it. There's still plenty of things they cannot do. But one of the most important pieces of what it means to become bar mitzvah, a son or daughter of the commandments, is that they are taking on more responsibility in the world. And that's actually my lead in to the conversation about a Devar Torah, about a teaching. One of the most important responsibilities that we have in our lives is the capacity and the importance of teaching others. We do that through our actions. We do that through our ability to articulate our feelings and our views on the world. And our tradition, especially with Talmud, is guiding us towards that responsibility. So part of studying Talmud is to hone our skills, not just to receive information, but how do we then be able to turn that around and take the responsibility of teaching the lessons of those stories to others. So I want you to be keeping that in mind as we look at this. And I know, thank you. There's the resource has been put up. If you don't have the text, you should be able to get it from the chat, or you can get it online. But let us go to the story. Let me get it all prepped here and share my screen, and away we will go. Okay. Today, Kamsa versus Bar Kamza. But before we even get into that, there is a little bit of background text that I wanted to share with you. Now, the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamza is one that we use a lot when we are preparing for Tisha B'Av, which comes in the summer, and this is the only other day of 24-hour fasting other than Yom Kippur. Tisha B'Av, commemorating the destruction of the temple. And this story is sometimes used around that holiday as a description for why the temple was destroyed. And so I wanted to bring that to you today, but a little bit of the background text first. So the background text comes from Yoma, and it is discussing the two temples, since there were two temples. The second one was being destroyed in the year 70, the first one being destroyed in 586 BCE. So why was the first temple destroyed? Because of three things that occurred in it: idolatry, unseemly provocative sexual behavior, and bloodshed. But the second temple, where they occupied themselves with Torah, commandments, and acts of benevolence, why was it destroyed? Because there was sinat chinam, baseless hatred. This teaches that baseless hatred is equated with three sins: idolatry, provocative sexual behavior, and bloodshed. In other words, the first temple was destroyed because there was a lot of illicit behavior happening in that temple. There was idolatry, there were people having sexual behavior that was not appropriate, and there was murder. All of these things. However, the second temple, where people had kind of gotten their act together, and the second temple was a period in which things were going well in the temple and with the temple leadership. Why was it destroyed? Why would this happen? According to the Talmud and the rabbis, it's because of baseless hatred, which we are now going to read about in the next story. And baseless hatred is equal to all three of the sins that led to the destruction of the first temple. That's a very significant statement to make, that the combination of idolatry, illicit sexual behavior, and murder are equated to baseless or senseless hatred. That's a strong statement about the power of hatred, according to the rabbis. Okay, so that's just a little background. Now let's get into the story. It's found in Gittin. Gittin, if you think of the word get, when someone gets divorced in Jewish tradition, the idea of the get, Gittin is a section that focuses on the laws of divorce. So you can see that one of the ways you can connect this story to the laws of divorce is the fact that the Jewish people and Jewish tradition was being divorced at the time of the destruction of the second temple, to the point where there was a complete reworking of what Jewish tradition looked like after the destruction of the temple. So here's the story. Rabbi Yochanan said, "What is illustrative of the verse, 'Happy is the man that fears always, but he that harden his heart shall fall into mischief'?" He's quoting Proverbs. I'm sorry I didn't include it, but this is Proverbs 28:14. Proverbs chapter 28, verse 14. Some translate it as, "Happy is the man that is always anxious, but he that harden his heart shall fall into mischief." Okay, so in other words, the rabbi is asking, what is illustrative of this? How can we understand this verse? "Happy is the man that fear always, but he that harden his heart shall fall into mischief." And now I'm just going to read the whole story through, and then we'll go back and break it down. The destruction of Jerusalem came through a Kamza and a Bar Kamza. The destruction of Jerusalem came through a Kamza and a Bar Kamza in this way. A certain man had a friend, Kamza, and an enemy, Bar Kamza. He once made a party and said to his servant, "Go and bring Kamza." The man went and brought Bar Kamza. When the man who gave the party found him there, he said, "See, you tell tales about me. What are you doing here? Get out." Said the other, "Since I am here, let me stay, and I will pay you for whatever I eat and drink." He said, "I won't." "Then let me give you half the cost of the party." "No," said the other. "Then let me pay for the whole party." He still said no, and he took him by the hand and put him out. Said the other, "Since the rabbis were sitting there and did not stop him, this shows that they agreed with him. I will go and inform against them," misspelling them, "to the government." He went and said to the emperor, "The Jews are rebelling against you." He, the emperor, said, "How can I tell?" He said to him, "Send them an offering and see whether they will offer it on the altar." So the emperor sent with him a fine calf. While on the way, he made a blemish on its upper lip, or as some say, on the white of its eye, in a place where we, Jews, count a blemish, but they do not. The rabbis were inclined to offer it in order not to offend the government. Said Rabbi Zachariah ben Abkulas to them, "People will say that blemished animals are offered on the altar." They then proposed to kill Bar Kamza so that he should not go and inform against them. But Rabbi Zachariah ben Abklus said to them, "Is one who makes a blemish on consecrated animals to be put to death?" Rabbi Yochanan thereupon remarked, through the scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah ben Apkulus, our house has been destroyed, our temple burnt, and we ourselves exiled from our land. Okay, we're going to go back now and break down the story. And I want you to be thinking about who is responsible here for the destruction of the temple, and what lessons are the rabbis trying to teach us with this story. Okay, that's what we're looking at of what's going on here. So again, I'm going to share my screen. We're going to go break it down again. It's not a very long story. It's not as complicated as last week's Ugly Man story, but it does have some really important points. And I think one of the most interesting parts of this text is where do things break down? At what point do we start to lead to the fact that at the end of this story, we have the destruction of the temple? And according to the rabbis, the destruction of the temple comes because of this engagement. Of course, it's just a story. It's not historical. One of the most important things that we learn from this idea is that the rabbis, even though there are, of course, historical reasons why certain things happen to the Jewish people throughout history, the rabbis are usually coming from it from an ethical perspective or an educational perspective. They're wanting us to learn a lesson. One of the things that I think about right now, and I'm torn about this, is what are we supposed to be learning from COVID-19 and what's happening to us right now? The rabbis in this story do not look to God pretty much at all as the reason for the destruction of the temple. The same could be said for what's happening right now to us. Are we supposed to turn to God and look at God as the reason for this? Are we supposed to look at the faults of our society and how we're set up? There are a lot of ways in which we can look for ethical and educational learning opportunities from what we're going through right now in our society. And I think now is the time for us to be reflecting on that for ourselves. What am I learning for myself about what's going on right now? And what am I learning about how I interact with my family, how I interact with the world, how I consume information and the news, how I approach moving out into the world when I go out and I go shopping, and how I see other people. All of this is illustrative of how we need to be thinking as we move further and further out of quarantine into the world in the weeks, God willing, the weeks, at least in the months to come. Okay, so back to the story. Okay. Happy is the man that fear always, but he that harden his heart shall fall into mischief. That's supposed to be the frame, and that this story is supposed to teach us something about, well, those who have fear always are happy, but those who harden their heart shall fall into mischief and cause problems. So this really is a story about hardening our heart. Of course, it makes me think of Pharaoh and the hardening of his heart as well. Okay, so we go on. Destruction of Jerusalem, all of it came out of a misunderstanding from something as simple as a name. Kamza and Bar Kamza. A certain man, this man who's throwing this party, had a friend named Kamza, and he has an enemy who has a pretty cool, similar name, Bar Kamza. And so he's about to have this party, and he tells his servant to go out and get his friend. Of course, he wants his friend to be at his party. But the servant goes out and makes a mistake and actually brings his enemy, because their names are pretty close together. And when this man shows up, the host says, "What are you doing? You're my enemy. You tell tales about me. You gossip about me. What are you doing here? Get out of here." Now, the man, Bar Kamza, says, "Well, I'm here. Just let me stay and I'll pay for whatever I eat and drink." He doesn't walk out. He doesn't want to leave. He wants to stay. We have no idea what his motivation is. Maybe his motivation is the fact that he doesn't want to be to have to then leave a party. Maybe his motivation is he told tales and he said bad things about the host earlier on, and maybe he wants to take advantage of this opportunity to find out more information to use it against the host. We have no idea, and it doesn't really seem to matter, according to the rabbis, what his intention is. The intention seems to be that he wants to stay. But the host says, "No, I'm not going to let you just stay, even if you want to pay for your food." And then the host, the Bar Kamza, says, "Well, then let me pay for half the party." right? So clearly he's also a wealthy man. He's willing to say, I'm gonna pay for half this party if you let me stay, upping the ante of his desire to stay at this party, even though the host doesn't want him here. Interesting decision, right? Most of us, if we were to go to a party where we, someone we didn't actually like, or someone we weren't so close with invited us to a party, we might initially think, interesting, didn't think I'd be invited to that, but we might show up out of respect. But if the person then said, oh, you're here and I don't want you here, how many of us would actually stick around and say, oh, just, I'm happy to stay here, I'll pay for what I'm going to eat. And even then, if the host were to say, no, actually, I really don't want you here, would we then go to the next level of saying, oh, I'm willing to pay for half your party? Most people wouldn't. So again, this is probably an exaggeration, but what is the lesson that is supposed to be, what are we supposed to be learning here? So I'll pay for half the party. The host says, no way. Then let me pay for the whole party, says Bar Kamza. I'm willing to put all of this on my dime. And still, the host said no, and he took him by the hand and he put him out. Now he physically removes Bar Kamza from the party. And so Bar Kamza gets out of this party and says, well, this host was a well-respected man in the community. There were rabbis who were sitting there and they didn't stop him. So clearly they agree with this host that in terms of the way he treated me. And so, you know what? I'm going to go inform against them to the government, the Roman government, who was in charge at the time, kind of oversaw Jerusalem, and this part of the world was under their control. So now Bar Kamza leaves the party, goes to the Roman government, and he goes to the emperor, and he says, the Jews are rebelling against you. So now he's speaking out against the people with whom he lives in his town. He is about to go up to the enemy, which is the Roman government, and say, my people, they're about to rebel against you. And so the emperor says, how can I tell? How do I know this is going to happen? He said to him, so now Bar Kamza says to the emperor, you know what, send them an offering and see whether they're going to offer it on the altar at the temple in Jerusalem. So the emperor sent with him a fine calf. Usually, the emperor would send something beautiful to make a sign of potentially peace, or at least to see how the people he oversees are going to respond to this gift. And so he sent them a fine calf, one that they would sacrifice on the altar. But on the way, Bar Kamza makes a blemish on the upper lip, or as some say, on the white of its eye. In other words, a place that would make it impossible for the rabbis and the priests of the temple to offer the sacrifice, because it's not a pure animal, it's impure, and therefore it's blemished, and therefore it can't be offered. The rabbis, though, were inclined to offer it anyway in order not to offend the government, right? Because now they're in the position, well, the Roman government, we know how powerful they are. If we don't offer this animal up for sacrifice, then the Roman government's going to be offended and assume that we're trying to rebel against them. Maybe we break the rule in order to have some peace. However, this Rabbi Zachariah says, people will say that blemished animals are offered on the altar. If we were to make an exception to this, then our whole system potentially could be crushed, because now we're undermining the whole system that we have set up for ourselves. Okay, so now we are pitting two mentalities against each other. One, a willingness to budge, even though it may go against the norm or against our legal code or our system of practice. And those who are the hard line, in this case, Rabbi Zachariah, who says, you do that, it undermines everything we do. Both valid arguments, right? Then they propose to kill Bar Kamza. Now the rabbis are talking about killing this man so that he should not go and inform against them. He's the one who just brought this blemished animal, and they know that if they don't offer this animal for a sacrifice, which they seem to be indicating they're not going to do, because if they're willing to kill this guy, that means that they're probably not going to sacrifice the animal. Now they're thinking about killing this guy so that he can't go back to the Roman government and rat them out, because that would be bad news. And again, Rabbi Zachariah says, is one who makes a blemish on consecrated animals to be put to death? The same guy who said, we can't break any rules. Now you're going to say, again, his standard is, so you're going to put someone to death because of the fact that he just put a blemish on an animal? No, you can't do that. And which now sets them up for being in a very weird position. Here's the rabbi who said, we don't want to undermine our authority and the system we have. And at the same time, by not doing that, we're going to let this guy go back. And as a result, he's going to rat us out, and then we'll potentially be destroyed. Rabbi Yochanan thereupon remarked, through the scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah ben Apkulus, our house has been destroyed, our temple burnt, and we ourselves exiled from our land. Which seems to give the suggestion that it's this rabbi who somehow, through his scrupulousness, through the way in which he is defining and interpreting Torah and laws, it's his fault that the temple was destroyed, and therefore all of Jewish religion as we know it at that time was completely transitioned into something new, right? Really interesting point of view. So a couple of things before I really want to turn it over and get your thoughts on. Number one, who is responsible here? Who made the mistake? Was it the servant who brought the wrong guy? Was it the host for the way he treated Bar Kamza? Was it Bar Kamza for the way that he acted by going out after this party and basically wanting to take revenge, and as a result leading to the destruction? Is it the rabbis who are at the party when this party is happening, who just sit back and don't do anything while this host is attacking Bar Kamza, and they don't step in and they just kind of let it happen and they stand idly by? And then, so is it their fault? Is it the rabbis who later on are struggling with the decision on whether or not to offer the sacrifice, and they go? Or is it this Rabbi Zechariah who seems to be very, I wouldn't say fanatical potentially, but almost he's very much in a box in terms of how he understands the law, and it's because of him and his perspective that everything is destroyed. Right, there are a lot of characters here, and I think that they're basically all responsible. I think what this story seems to be teaching us is that, again, similar to what we discussed last week with the ugly man story, that there are significant repercussions of some of the most basic interactions that we can have with other people. In this case, the rabbis seem to be suggesting that the hatred between people, or the willingness to stand idly by, there are also, there are a lot of themes here. All of these things lead to significant destruction if you're not careful with the most basic ways in which we interact with one another. That seems to be a very clear message from this story. I think another one is this internal fighting, right? This is, and one of the reasons this story is used for the Jewish community to look in the mirror and look at itself, is that when there is infighting between the Jewish people, that can lead to destruction. That we are supposed to be united. Now, united does not necessarily mean everyone agrees with one another, but when there is undermining of one another, when there's backstabbing, when there is a desire to take revenge, that can destroy the entire system, and not just your enemy, or someone with whom you disagree, but it can take down the entire thing. So that seems to be another lesson that we are supposed to learn from this. Another, I think, is that, again, God is not a part of this story. We cannot blame God or look to God, nor does our theology of as Jews necessarily put the responsibility on God for all the things that are happening in the world. That's just not the way. It's too simple of a way in which we're supposed to understand our relationship with God individually and collectively. You can't just see God that way. We were given free will at the beginning of time. Adam and Eve, we were given free will at the very beginning of our people's journey, of the creation of the world, actually. And ever since then, just as we discussed some weeks ago about the story of the oven of Achnai, where God says, the Torah, or the rabbis actually say, the Torah is not in heaven, and God actually laughs and says, my children have defeated me. that we have such responsibility that putting off that responsibility onto God is just not the way in which our theology is supposed to work. So our human interactions with one another have the capacity, obviously, to build, but even more significantly, the capacity to destroy. So that's a little bit of an overview. I'm curious, other takes, other perspectives, things that stood out to you as you were listening to the story, studying the story, about who is really responsible here. Do you feel that there is one person in particular who this really falls on? Is that the best way we should be reading this? Is it good? And is it more productive to actually be able to point responsibility to one person? Because by doing that, we can really see how that one individual has an impact on everything else. Or should we take a more broader view that everyone's really at fault, and that we need to focus on that? By the way, if you hear some music in the background, my daughter is practicing saxophone. Yay. Okay, so any thoughts, perspectives? I would love, you can just raise your hand. I see Claudia has raised her hand. So you, just so you know, you can raise your hand, you can write in the chat, whatever you want to do. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So Claudia, hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. I love all of your interpretations. The one thing stood out for me. Rabbi Zechariah, I mean, the rabbis were the sages at the time, so there was like this chain of events that went extremely wrong, but they were the sages, and to me it's also a lesson against extreme intransigence. Maybe, you know, should he had offered the animal for sacrifice, none of this would have happened. So being too strict to interpretation could lead to disaster.
Absolutely. I think that is a really important lesson. And I think that's the rabbis reminding themselves and their colleagues about that as they continue to go through the decisions that they make, similar to a story that we studied, again, the Oven of Achnai, which was about strictly interpreting the law. That strict interpretation can lead to that destruction very quickly. So yes, that's a really excellent point. I think the rabbis are being critical of themselves, and they're also being critical of all of us who may be so strict in our perspective and not being, when we're not willing to open up a little bit more and change the way in which we understand boundaries, we set ourselves up for failure. That there is a malleability about how the world works, and if you can't adjust to that, you don't survive, right? And we are all experiencing that right now. That is exactly what Safer at Home is all about: a malleability to adjust and to be able to adapt to a new lifestyle. It doesn't make it any easy. It doesn't make it easy at all, of course. Like, there is a significant struggle with that ability and willingness to play with boundaries. However, if we don't do that, we fail, right? And so it's a really interesting thing, especially as there are certain states who are opening up boundaries, so to speak, when it comes to Safer at Home versus others like California, which are keeping a real lockdown. What does that mean? I mean, it's just an interesting, fascinating time for us, even in our country right now, as we are starting to see various places play with boundaries. And pretty soon, I think each of us individually is going to be really testing ourselves to figure out our own boundaries of what does it mean? When do we want to stay within the strict boundaries that the CDC and our local governments are saying in terms of how we are supposed to engage in the world, versus how we start to feel as we continue to be cooped up? And how do you decide what those boundaries are? And how do you understand what your limits are? And how do you become flexible with what other people are doing too, right? There's also a level of judgment that I think I've already started seeing creeping up a little in terms of how people are viewing others. It's not just the political scene anymore. It's really now going to be, oh, so they're willing to go out. What does that mean for my relationship with them, right? These are all things that I think are coming out a little more. Esther.
Unmute. Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Really am enjoying this story as well. And one of the first things that I wrote down, which you touched on a little bit, is the question for myself: what do we miss when we harden our hearts? So in terms of answering the question, like, who do I think is responsible? I would say it starts off with the host. And because, here he has a guest that is, wasn't just sent the invitation by mistake, actually is there in his home, and he's saying, I want to stay. And the host is saying, no, absolutely not. And then, he offers to like pay for himself, which I take as a symbol for what, he's offering a gift. He's offering something in exchange for being there that is small at first. And then the host, by saying no, he ups the ante and he says, well, I'll pay for half the party. And that to me, the symbolism of, what this person, for whatever, putting aside his intentions and assuming good ones, what could this person bring to, to what's happening? Could he bring interesting conversation? Could he bring his own connections? And so this is the lesson that kind of is sticking with me at the moment, that, when we harden our hearts for what reason, that's maybe immutable to us, that we miss out on certain gifts. So that's kind of what I was thinking when we were talking about the story.
Great. I love that. Thank you. And again, also on that, the hardening of the heart may be hardened initially by the host, and then that host's hardened heart leads to Bar Kamza starting to harden his heart even more. And then he goes out and he wants to take revenge and destroy, right? So again, a really important lesson for each one of us. Can we learn to recognize when we're starting to harden our own heart? Can we be attuned enough to our own thinking, our own emotional space, wherever we are? Can we be so tuned in, or can we kind of work that muscle over time to become aware of that, so that we don't necessarily get to the breaking point where our heart is hardened, where we can then, because when we do that, it's not just it doesn't just impact us and our relationship with other people, that those people with whom we have a hardened heart can go out and end up doing really terrible things. And it really, even though we might not want to admit it, could be our fault. And we may not even know that. We might never know that. And so that we're not supposed to necessarily sit with that guilt of that every time that we have done something wrong to someone else, that we may have led to destruction. However, I think this is really a lesson from the rabbis, that you are destroying if every single person is supposed to be like the sanctuary, like the Holy of Holies, like a temple. This is really not a story about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. This is the story about the destruction of holiness within each individual, and the capacity for us to destroy ourselves and to destroy others. And the power that we have is so significant that we don't usually give ourselves enough credit for the power that we have. The power we hold over ourselves and the power we hold over other people, not just our family members and those with whom we have close relationships, but even those with whom we don't have relationships, or those for whom we try to distance ourselves. That even the smallest way in which we harden our hearts in those exchanges with others can be so detrimental and destroy so much. That the temple is representative of a system where there is peace. And just as we read the first story, the first kind of the prequel, which was the difference between the first temple being destroyed and the second, right? The second temple was a time where, as it said, when people were occupied with commandments and Torah, acts of benevolence, right? Even in those times where we may be feeling like we are surrounding ourselves with joy and the right things, there is still that opportunity that something can boil up inside us, and we have to be very aware of that. Any other thoughts or interpretations about either characters? As Esther pointed out, she was really at this point at least focusing on the host's hardening of his heart, and Bar Kamza, who was the enemy of this man, at least from her perspective, his intention being potentially that, look, I'm willing to make amends, or at least that I'm willing to have some peace right now in this moment. And the host's unwillingness to do that. And that, so any other thoughts? I think, of course, about the rabbis who are sitting there, not only because I am a rabbi, but I think one very important lesson that we gain from this is the fact that there are so many times where we may just want to just sit back and watch the debate because we either don't want to embarrass ourselves or other people, or we may not just want to get involved in something that we don't feel is our issue. However, it comes back to the rabbis at the end. In other words, it is your issue. You can't actually ever just stand by without it impacting you. I think that's a lesson, an important lesson that's coming out of this story. You really can't believe that you are going to stand idly by and that it won't impact you down the road, because it can impact you down the road. Now, this happens, of course, when we think about justice in our society and the need for us to be vocal about our morals and our ethics and what we stand for, and that we have a responsibility to speak up about that on a societal level in order to try and do what we can, but also in settings where we may feel like, it's not my place. Well, there are maybe ways in which we can engage, and maybe not, if it's not in the moment, how do we make sure we're not just standing idly by? Because it can get to us and it can impact us even down the road. So I think that's an important lesson that we learned from the rabbis who are at that party, who are engaging, who want to be a part of it, who probably for political reasons want to make nice. And at the same time, by them not stepping in, it leads to some real problems down the road. Any other thoughts, feedback, questions, anything else that this raises for you? Oh, I see the Q&A. Names are so similar. Esther also wrote, similar point about last week, names are so similar. This could be our own self-hatred, self-judgment. Okay, great. So again, I love this. I'll let Esther, do you want to maybe explain this a little more? Go ahead.
So I was just saying that last week I had this idea and this interpretation of the story of, the ugly man was actually the reflection of the rabbi and, part of himself that he was having the debate with. So I feel like these are, little, what do they call them, Easter eggs in the stories, and that because the names are so similar, maybe it's one way of saying, this person could be like another physical person, but it could also be that piece of each of us that is self-doubt or that is judgment, that we argue with, that it represents the external kind of argument, represents the internal struggle that we sometimes have with ourselves.
Nice. Oh, thank you. Thank you. I love the birds in the background, by the way.
Sing all day
It's very
long.
nice. Yeah, it's great. Carol, you wanted to ask a question. Go ahead.
I wanted to know how this particular story that from the Talmud applies to today's situations.
Do you have any ideas yourself? It's just a very rabbinic way of answering a question by asking a question, but I'm curious, is there anything that comes to mind for you before I open it up either to others or I can give my own thoughts?
Well, I don't want to get political. Let's put it that way, but it obviously is a political question.
Go more. You can go there. It's okay.
Okay. All right. Well, we have members of our government, Congress in particular, who seem to not be able to be honorable. And they are deflecting anything that's supposed to be real into something that is false and making the false appear to be the truth.
Yeah. Okay. So yes. So I think I get what you're saying. I think you're right. This has a lot of applications to government, right? Because the rabbis in this case were a governing body. And of course, the Roman government also plays a role as another government that's coming into play here. You can imagine that this is the local government or one country's government versus another's and how they interact with one another and the role that that a government plays in terms of how it wants to engage and build relationships with others. One way is to hold the firm line and potentially lead to some disrespect or some negativity between governments. And of course, this also applies to a government in itself, because at the time, the rabbis were really looking at their own governmental system in the Jewish community and sending a warning that you need to be able to debate and disagree in a way that doesn't come from a place of hatred. And what we have in this country right now is a lot of hatred and divisiveness on both sides. And that plays out in a lot of different ways, and we don't need to get into all the details, but I think one of the ways that we can look at the story is how do we engage with people with whom we disagree, and how we can't necessarily change the leaders and the way they act. The only way we can change them is how we vote and how we decide to either support the way in which our leaders are acting and the way they're governing, or we change that by the way we vote, of course. But I do think it all starts, just like how in politics they talk about you start at the local level. The most localized way in which we start to deal with politics is how we engage with people within our own community. That even starts within families, right? Even in families, people have different political perspectives. How do we start again to train ourselves to set ourselves up for the type of engagement where it doesn't get to the point of hatred or revenge or talking to one another in a way that is cutting, but instead by asking questions and actually being curious and not necessarily coming to agreement at the end of the day, but really getting to a place where we can engage in conversations in a healthy way. Now, I don't see that that's coming anytime in the near future on a national level for us, unfortunately. However, over time, if there's a groundswell of people who can somehow change the way in which they interact with one another, away from hardening of hearts and more towards an openness, just like the story is saying, a fanaticism leads to destruction, and a fanaticism exists on both sides of the aisle, right? How do we come to a place where there is a sense of moderation? And moderation, I think, is a really important piece of this story. Susan, hi. You had something to say?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My computer crashed during this wonderful session, so I hope I'm not asking something that has already been covered. Some of these remind me of Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Eliezer that you had before with the ostracized party, Eliezer being so angered by and hurt by Eliezer's, Gamliel's ostracizing him, that he supposedly caused Gamliel's death. The Bar Kamza was ostracized, and there he was taking revenge. So that was one thing. The other is that doesn't Bar mean son of, like Ben? It's son of.
Yep.
Is that, could this be the son of? I thought it too about the different sides of a person, but maybe the son of the friend.
Yeah, that's a great interpretation too. Yeah, so yes, on both points. I did mention earlier the idea that the connections to the Oven Abachnai, and the relationships that exist between the characters there, for sure. There's a general theme, as I was kind of thinking about all the sessions we've had up to this point. There tends to be a theme. Maybe it's my own theme that I continue to want to explore, but there is this theme very much, of course, of relationships and of the importance of being aware of how relationships can be either destructive or creative. And to the second point, yes, bar does mean son. So is this, as Esther also alluded to earlier, maybe two parts of the same person, or is this a childlike emotional place that we're being told to be reminded of. That Bar Kamza represents that childlike place within us that isn't aware yet of the impact that we have on the world, and that each of us has that capacity to go back to that childlike state. And when we do that, that is dangerous. That we have to continually be growing and not going backwards in time, developmentally, to a place where we weren't as aware of how complex the world is. But instead, we need to be developing and growing more and more, because as soon as we become premature or pediatric in how we are seeing ourselves or how we're seeing the world, that can be very destructive as well. So thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Well, thank you all very much for another engaging session. I really appreciate you taking the time in the middle of your day to study with me. Of course, you have my email, so just like a few people did last week, you can feel free to engage me in continuing this conversation over email. Hopefully you'll come back in the coming weeks for more stories as I continue to I think, open my own eyes. I love this. This is a chance for me to continue to study these stories. But also, I hope this is an opportunity for you to understand how you can place these ancient stories within the context of our own lives today. So thank you very much. An early Shabbat Shalom, and look forward to seeing you, being with you at least, not seeing you, but being with you next week. All right, bye. Thank you.